Today we have the honor of introducing Michele Phoenix. Just so you know, Mukapa is a student organization here on campus for missionary kids and third culture kids. Basically, anyone who's spent a significant part of their formative years in a culture other than their parents. After the talk, she's going to be in the Wilberforce room with coffee. She'd love to talk with you guys, answer questions, have conversations. And if any of you are interested in this topic, or if any of you are TCKs or MKs with questions who want to talk with her, we're also going to have a dessert reception for her in the Great Room at 6 p.m. this evening, so you're invited to come to that as well. No further introduction, please introduce Michele Phoenix, or greet her.
So, good morning. This is Taylor University, huh? Thank you for having me today. Black Forest Academy. Anybody here from Black Forest Academy? He just mentioned that school where I taught for 20 years. Anybody? Okay, good. Thanks for the enthusiasm. So I realize this is probably a bit of a different topic for chapel. I don't know of any other school, actually, university college, that has had a whole talk about TCKs and MKs. But it's an important one. I believe that part of God's design for us is that we would represent Him, and one of the ways that we do that is how we live in community. And there's a lot of talk about community in a place like this. I know there is. It's a good thing. It's a good word. It's a great goal. It's a life-enhancing concept. And you'll hear figureheads in pop culture and from pulpits and other places telling you that the way to community is through tolerance. And again, tolerance is good and valid and important, but I believe that community is found through understanding more than through tolerance. Understanding draws us into relationship with each other, and relationship draws us into a community that truly reflects who God is. So it's within that framework that I'm going to talk this morning to introduce this community to some of your members who live among you. Some of them are visibly to you, not from here, and some of them are not so visibly, not from here. But I think if we can promote understanding of self and other, on their side for you, on your side for them, that this can lead to a stronger and more God-glorifying community here. Now, I'm going to use generalizations this morning. There are exceptions to everything I say, but there's no way to talk about a people group without talking in terms of generalizations. So if you are multicultural here this morning, I'm hoping that something I say will help you to put words to aspects of yourself that you may not have been capable of articulating until now. And if you are a non-multicultural person, I'll call you monocultural. That's not a negative statement. It's just the contrast between multi and mono. My hope is that by exploring this people group that lives among you, that you'll better understand the invisible reasons that they might perplex you sometimes. I believe that better understanding of self and other can lend us all a common vocabulary. And community must begin with conversation. So let this be a vocabulary imparting moment for us this morning. I'm going to use two acronyms. The first is MK, so this would be Missionaries' Kids, the children of missionaries. Now, I've been told that many of you gather up in that section during chapel, which is not going to help me when I do a hand-raising thing, so maybe use your voices instead of your hands. How many of you here have parents who are missionaries? Raise your hands tall and proud so we know who and where you are. And up there. What most North Americans know about missionaries is those prayer cards that are up on your parents' fridge. You're either a Kardashian or a missionary if every 2 years you take a glamour shot and send it to all your friends and relatives. Because I am an MK, and I was born and raised in France by a Canadian mother and a Canadian father and an American mother. Sorry. I have a drawer full of pictures like this. And there are probably still good little Baptist churches in Indiana and Michigan that have this on their missionary bulletin board. Some of our attempts at conveying the joy of ministry don't work out, tend to fail. Here's a really happy one. Any art majors here who can think of an American art piece that is represented by this? It goes a bit like that. And sometimes during our photo shoots, we just have epic fails. This is a real outtake from one of our family photo shoots. Come on. There it is. therapy is ongoing. But I'm not just going to talk about MKs this morning. I'm going to talk about third culture kids too, and you've already heard that definition. It's defined as a person who has spent a significant number of his or her formative years in a culture other than his or her passport culture. So this would include, missionaries' kids are in there, business kids, diplomats' kids, military kids for sure would be part of the third culture kid category. So based on that, how many of you are third culture kids? Raise your hands tall and proud if you are. Okay, a few more. So this is how these people groups are represented among you. My last question for show of hands is, how many of you know and love an MK or a TCK based on these definitions that I've given you this morning? Yeah, that's the importance of what we're doing this morning. I went to Wheaton College, I'm sorry. And I had this great room on the quad, which was this area of campus where people crossed between classes, and I could sit at my window and pick out the TCK. In those days, it was a lot easier to do. The MKs and TCKs were the ones who wore Birkenstocks and blizzards. They were the ones who would carry their backpacks on both shoulders in an era when it was cool to carry it on just one shoulder, Saved by the Bell, right? We had that one shoulder technique going on. And they were also the people who wore thrift store kind of clothing before it was the chic and cool thing to do back in those days. We're not as easy to pick out of the crowd today, in part because the world has shrunk and we all know how the rest of the world behaves more than we did back in those days. But there are still significant differences within us that might not be obvious from the outside looking in. In a smaller crowd, this is where I would usually say, tell me traits that you think apply to TCKs, common traits that you would say, yeah, usually they're like this. And the answers I usually get are world savvy, they speak multiple languages, they can be observant, they can be more inclusive. And then there's this kind of code word I hear, they can be socially different, which we know is code for, oh, there they are, weird. I would like to reframe that this morning as different, because understanding requires that we get rid of words like this and that we use words like different, because that allows for exploration and learning. The word I prefer to use and that we use in my circle of people who do this kind of work is hidden immigrant. So on the outside, we look, talk, act like most people in this culture, but on the inside, we're not from here. Does that make sense? So we actually have kind of a patron saint. They made a movie about him a few years back. He looks, talks, acts the part, but you can tell if you observe him long enough that he might not be one of you, and this is him. In many ways, TCKs are just like him. We're living in this world that is not our own, and every so often something gurgles out that isn't supposed to be there or that isn't done the way it's done here. So I'd like to explore 4 areas of difference this morning that you may have noticed in the MKs and TCKs you love, and then 1 area of shared strength where we can all profit from what it is that we bring to the table. Here's the most important thing, I think, for all of us to understand. And this is something that I do with young kids. When I go overseas and talk in schools, TCK and MK schools overseas, sometimes I do elementary classes. And it's hard to get some of these more profound truths across to them. So I look for the toughest kid in the class, and I give him a jar, and into that jar I pour red beads. And I say, well, this is your passport culture. You come from planet red. Here are your red beads. And then I pour blue beads into that same jar. And I say, okay, shake that up as hard as you can. And he just shakes the life out of that jar. And when he's finished, I say, can you still see the red and the blue beads? And of course, you still can, right? Because they're mixed, they're intermingled, but they're still red and blue. This is the way adults experience cross-cultural living. So if as an adult you go to another culture, you're still going to have a fairly clear understanding of what is what. Then I give that same 3rd grader 2 balls of Play-Doh. And I say, go ahead and mash these together to your heart's content. And he mashes away. And when he's finished, you know what he has, right? He has this big old ball of blue Play-Doh, purple Play-Doh. This is the way TCKs experience cross-cultures. It's not something that's clearly defined and easy to kind of separate in our minds. It's this wonderful, complex, confusing, crazy, intimate mingling of everything that we have ever known and experienced. So out of this purple is what comes the demonstration, the reflection of our other cultures, which looks weird, but is really only different. It's an expression of our purpleness. One of the difficulties that comes from it is that we don't know what belongs in each culture because they aren't separate in our minds. They're woven together. So one example of that is that I grew up in France, as I said, in the French school system. And one of the differences in France is that it is okay to cheat in class. And I grew up absorbing that as a universal truth, right? So the teacher knows you're cheating, your friends know you're cheating. It's kind of a status symbol to be the best cheater in the class in French schools. And I'm an overachiever, so I got really good at cheating. And it's only wrong if you get caught, and then it's wrong because you were dumb enough to get caught, not because you were cheating in the first place, right? So I left French schools in 9th grade, and I moved to a little missionary school in Germany. And I wanted to establish myself and have social status. So my first Bible test, I went ahead and cheated. And then I told my friends about it. And then I hinted to my teachers that I had cheated. And I discovered very rapidly that what belongs in one culture does not necessarily belong in other cultures. Sometimes it is unintentional when we do things that are shocking or disquieting to people who belong in that culture. We just don't know. So out of this purpleness, some of us will point with our lips instead of our fingers. Anybody come from cultures where that happens? Some of us will blow our nose like a bullhorn. You can be in the middle of the quietest meeting and somebody in the back row will scare the you-know-what out of you blowing their nose because in some cultures you're supposed to make it as loud as you can. You'll never look somebody in the eye. There are a lot of cultures where if somebody is older than you or in authority over you, you never make eye contact with them. Imagine that third culture kid coming back to this culture and going for a job interview and not looking the interviewer in the eye. Do you see how that would send the wrong message? We might never use our left hand. There are cultures where the left hand is never used for anything related to food, whether it be food preparation or setting the table or whatever. Do y'all know why? Yeah, because it's kind of toilet paper in some cultures, so you don't want to be using that hand for anything related to food. So you might see MKs at your tables here doing everything with their right hand while they're eating and never using the left. It might be part of their purple, part of the culture that they brought to it. But it goes beyond the behavioral differences. Pardon me while I pull on Marco Rubio. We think differently also in subterranean ways, in the less obvious ways. And here are a few examples of that. We might think differently philosophically than the average monocultural does. What is truly valuable? What is a meaningful life? What is important to me? We might think differently on a moral level. Are there absolutes? We might come from cultures where there are no absolutes. What is modesty? Think of the different definitions of modesty from one culture to the other. We might think differently theologically in how we view God. There's a fascinating study to be done in going to other places and finding out how they interpret familiar verses like John 3:16. They will pull completely different meanings out of a verse that is so familiar to us. It's not that we're wrong or that we're heretics, it's that we come from cultures that interpret the Bible and that envision God in a different way that we might hear in this culture. Our differences might also be emotional. Some of us come from stoic cultures where you do not show emotion. It doesn't mean we don't care. It means that we haven't learned how to show those emotions. We might come from cultures where we don't have a vocabulary for some emotions, and we have to learn that all over again. Our differences might also be, and this is particularly important, I think, at this point in our lives in the United States, our differences might be political because our worldview is global. And because some of us have seen political theory play out either in disastrous ways or in great ways in other places around the world. It's not that we think you're wrong, it's that we have seen things differently. So those things that we easily label as weird might actually be valuable alternate perspectives and points of view that can stimulate and broaden everybody's thinking if we can just have conversations about it, explorative conversations. So that's the culturally complex piece. The next one is confused. Some of us feel confused. It's as if our lives are these flip sides. For every great thing that we enjoy, there's kind of a flip side that's not quite so enjoyable to it. For instance, yes, we have seen the world. We feel connected to multiple places in a real visceral way. But if you ever sat with a third culture kid and tried to watch, say, the Olympics or World Cup soccer, our loyalties are just torn between all these. We can have a nervous breakdown deciding who we're going to cheer for in a particular sports event because our loyalties are so totally with so many cultures. Another flip side is that we may have a lot of confidence in our international knowledge. We know what we know. We love to tell you what we know. The flip side of that is actually how people perceive that. Because sometimes when we're just talking about the place I grew up in a castle. My parents taught in a Bible school that was in a castle. To people hearing that through a monocultural grid and an American grid, it sounds like I'm bragging or being arrogant. And that isn't necessarily what we're doing. So that flip side of being misunderstood as arrogant. Now, usually here I do a show of hands and say, how many of you TCKs have had people tell you, stop bragging, stop boasting, and a lot of hands will go up. And then I'll ask the same TCKs, so tell me how many times you've kind of actually been bragging and arrogant in telling your childhood stories, and a lot of the hands will go up again. So yes, sometimes we are actually arrogant, but if you cannot assume when I talk about my castle that I'm rubbing it in your face, that would be really helpful for these conversations to be able to happen. And yes, we might appear highly savvy in some areas. I'm not boasting. It's just that as a result of being a TCK, we may know a lot of languages. We may be able to travel more easily than other people do. We may be able to live in a jungle for a while and make do with what we've got. But the flip side of that, and those of you who know and love MKs can probably attest to this, is that we are completely inept and clueless in other areas that seem so obvious to you. So some of those areas, actually, part of the frustration of this confusion is that we can have a philosophical conversation in 3 different languages 1 minute, and the next minute we don't know how many cents are in a dime, or why the dime is smaller than the nickel. Somebody explained that one to me. We may order fajitas at the restaurant and not know why people are laughing at us. We may consider, if we come from Romania or countries like that, that laws and rules are merely guidelines, and really a 20 should fix any of your problems that you have, right up until you get arrested in the United States for bribing a police officer. And some of us might try on clothes in the middle of the clothing store and not realize, oh, you're supposed to go to the changing rooms here. I didn't realize that that was a thing in America. So yes, we are culturally complex. We are somewhat confused, and we are a lot confusing. I understand that that's part of it too. And then the third point I'd like to make is that we are often conflicted. This has to do with the grief and the greatness of a lot of what we've experienced. If I were to ask TCKs, how many of you love that you grew up cross-culturally, most of the hands would go up. And if I were to ask the same TCKs, how many of you also know that you're carrying some pretty heavy stuff that you're going to have to deal with, raise your hands, most of those hands would go up again. We have this equal weight of the great and the grief that comes from living as we have. In their book, Third Culture Kids, Ruth Van Rieken and Dave Pollock said that the average third culture kid goes through 8 major moves by the age of 18. 8 major moves by the age of 18. And even those who aren't moving all the time, the world of international people is moving around us. So we might stay put for 10 years, and still, every year, sometimes every month or every week, there are more people that we need to say goodbye to. And that accumulates over time. The grief accumulates over time. It's hard to explain what it's like to move from planet red bead to planet blue bead for us because it is so woven into the purpleness of who we are. It's more than moving from San Diego to Boston. It is leaving everything that is familiar, the tangible and the intangible behind, and somehow finding our way in this new place that is supposed to be home. So the losses are huge. The losses are relatives, social networks, favorite things, favorite places, customs, foods, languages, sights, sounds, smells, security in that we knew how life worked, identity in that we knew who we were and people knew who we were. And the best word that I've come up with to try and explain this to people who are not purple is the word universe. It's as if every time we move, we lose a universe. Does that make sense? Does that give it a little bit more of that emotional weight? And it's hard for people who haven't lived as purple to understand just how significant that is. And then if you take the time to talk to any of these third culture kids in your midst and ask them about the hard stuff that also sometimes comes along with living cross-culturally, they'll be able to tell you about some of what they've experienced, which is not all glamorous and wonderful. There are things like trauma, the sense of unbelonging, abuse, anxiety, alienation, the losses that happen over and over again. And I guarantee you that we're not really comfortable initially talking about those things for a lot of reasons. The biggest one is the expectation that we be stronger than that. We are MKs. We have God on our side. We are doing God's work. So how dare we complain about having said goodbye to 50 significant people in our lives by the time we're 12? How dare we complain about having been laughed at or things thrown at us by the tribal people that we came to reach? How dare we? So we have pressure that we put on ourselves, and we sense it coming from others too, so it's difficult for us to broach these topics in diverse settings like this one, and I'd love for you to be aware of that. The reason that I do so much of my work with specifically MKs more than TCKs is because of the spiritual repercussion of this. If your family and your life gets flipped on its head and you get sent halfway around the world and everything gets really hard and your parents work for an oil company, you're going to be mad at the oil company. If the same thing happens because God called your parents, there's a good chance that that anger can turn itself back against God. And I've seen too many MKs reject it all because they could not reconcile a loving, sending God with some of the hard stuff that they've carried with them throughout their lives. Now, I am not saying that there's no way multiculturals can engage in relationship with monoculturals. I hope you're not hearing that. But this is where knowledge of self and other comes in. We have so much to learn from each other. We who are multicultural need to learn constancy, longevity of relationship, extended family dynamics. We need to learn all of that from you because we do relationships completely differently. And I want you to know what that is. I have a graphic that will hopefully, I wanted to say that too. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did the 5 stages of grief. I'm sure you're familiar with those. She also wrote this: a grief must be witnessed in order to be healed. Those are powerful words. That means that those of us who are in grief needs to speak it, and those of you who are friends with us need to hear it. And that can be something that starts right here at Taylor. So moving on to how we do relationships in a condensed way. What I've just talked about, the expectation of loss, is what motivates, even subconsciously, the way that we enter into relationships with people. When I was in Nepal a couple years ago, I was with a little boy, and I asked him, how do you say hello to people you meet? And he said, I put out my hand, and I shake their hand, and I say, hi, my name is Ryan, and I'm going to be gone soon. So he enters into relationship already expecting that at some point, probably unexpectedly, one of them is going to have to leave the relationship. Because of that, we look, I can't tell you the story. Ask the MKs who were there last night about Mark, who asked a girl to the banquet and enlisted my help to ask a girl to the banquet, and the next thing I knew, there were 12 police officers, German, unhappy police officers, surrounding my house with guns drawn, so ask your MK friends about that. But here we are. In a monocultural setting, we meet, and then over a period of time, we slowly descend into something that is authentic, meaningful relationship. Because we TCKs have this expectation that we don't have long here. We might think we do, but trust me, we don't have long here. We dive really deep, really fast, just to make sure that you're going to be worth the pain of losing you when it inevitably happens. Do you see how that can look weird to people who aren't used to that? So where monoculturals, your cliche level talking might be about sports and what you've seen on TV and classes and whatever, our cliche level, and we don't realize it's odd, but our cliche level might be my grandparents' health, my parents' marriage, my problems with my faith, and we talk about that in the first 30 seconds that we meet you because we need to dive deep and make the most of the time we've got. So this is something that you need to be aware of if you are in relationship with monoculturals, with multiculturals, because it's something, if you're used to that green line, you're going to look at us and go, oh, you're way too intense. And because we're used to that deep dive, we're going to go, oh, you're way too shallow. But the thing is, we all end up in true relationship eventually. And I would say to the TCKs here this morning that when you are the odd man out in a culture, cultures are made for those who belong in it to be comfortable. So it falls to us to try to adapt a little bit more to the way things are done here so that we're not freaking people out. And it can be done, it can be achieved. We need to be in relationship with each other. I think that if conversation happens, if shared vocabulary can lead to the conversations that help us to delve into the meaningful aspects of who self and other is, I think that the kind of relationships that can come from that are the kind that glorify and honor God. And that is my encouragement to you this morning. It requires openness, and it requires time and effort and exploration, and both of those are good efforts to put towards it. My last point is something that actually unites us all. If you're a TCK, this is how you're going to be able to impact the world in small and large ways. If you are planning on being a business owner someday or on being somebody who hires people, this is why you should consider hiring TCKs. And if you are a monocultural who has never stepped foot outside of Indiana, this is why we, as a group that includes TCKs, can all benefit from what we all bring to the table. It goes something like this. In a stable setting, in a setting that, that isn't influenced by outside forces, people tend to cluster together into groups that represent them. So say in a workplace, the IT people might kind of gravitate towards each other. The administration or the sales reps might gravitate towards each other. This is what generally happens in a static environment. And the person in the middle of each of those clusters is usually the person who most intensely represents the identity of that cluster, right? Well, MKs and TCKs are kind of edge dwellers by nature. We're not comfortable with the middle of these highly identified clusters. So we kind of gravitate around the edges of them, and we interact, but we don't really dive deep into what it is that that cluster is. But if we learn to gradually, that slowly descending line, right? If we learn to gradually enter into those clusters, as we increase our knowledge of self, of what we bring to the situation and other, if we accurately assess that environment, the impact we can have on static environments is this. Gradually, over time, as we are all speaking with each other and learning from each other, this can happen. What does it mean in real life? It means that we can expand viewpoints. We can encourage risk-taking. We can prove the efficacy of different methods. We can instigate change. We can introduce innovation. We can build bridges between clusters to diversify and fortify subcultures. This is what multiculturals bring to a monocultural environment. If we have the right attitude, which includes patience and excludes arrogance, and if that environment is willing to deal with our difference, with the purpleness that we bring to the situation. Just as we can draw you out, believe me, we need you to draw us in, because it can be lonely out on the outskirts of those clusters. On all sides, it has to begin with two things. Number one, with the vulnerability to assess and express our true selves. And number two, with the desire from both sides to pursue and explore those who are other than us. We may need to expose our cluelessness in the process. We may need to release the answers that we want to hear. We may need to relinquish the comfort of similar worldviews for the richness of diverse perspectives. It begins with enough confidence in self to be able to love others well. Brené Brown said this: "We cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor that connection that grows from that with trust, respect, and kindness." It always takes time and effort for communities like this, for communities like Taylor, to cultivate the beauty in those places where clusters and edge dwellers choose to merge their uniqueness into something good. But it also yields growth and power and the evidence of God. Intentional, joyous, diverse community is an expression of who He is. So whether you're multicultural here this morning or monocultural or just plain confused by everything I've just said to you, these words hold true. Oh, yeah, I want to say that too. True community can be achieved not in spite of insurmountable differences, but because of complementary differences. That's a shift in how we perceive things, isn't it? So when we see difference, rather than going, you're different than me, let me find my cluster that looks like me, if we can say, what are the complementary aspects of who you are and who I am, how you think and how I think, your conclusions and my conclusions, we can reach community in that way. Love one another. These are the words that hold true regardless of the community we belong to. In the same way I loved you, without measure, without fear, without holding back, you love one another. This is how the world will recognize that you are my disciples. Those conversations can begin and need to begin now in a place like this, because you are going to leave Taylor and you're going to influence the world. And if you can leave this place with an understanding of self and other that allows for true community, true God-representative community to happen, what a gift that is that you bring beyond these doors, beyond these walls. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you that you speak to us in so many diverse ways. And I pray that as we leave this room this morning, that we would have the vulnerability to sincerely seek out and learn from those who are other than us. Give us the courage to accurately assess and express our truest self. And God, give us the wisdom to see beyond the differences and to love each other as you love us, without restraint, exactly as we are. I thank you that you are the God of conversation, and that you are the God of unity, and that our greatest common point is you. Thank you for that. Amen. You are dismissed to classes.